There are over 30 DDD battles. Let's rank all of them. Given what's to come, it might seem unfair to rank an actual fight so low, especially a tutorial battle. While rare, Dedede occasionally serves as the introductory boss, adjusting his behavior to match the expected early game difficulty. His attacks follow predictable patterns, move at a slow pace and offer no extraordinary surprises, making for a perfectly serviceable introduction to boss mechanics, at least in theory. In reality, Dedede's encounter in Squeak Squad is as basic and uninspired as possible. Every attack is recycled from former titles with no unique twists or innovations. The only redeeming feature might be the monster summoning machine in the background, an admittedly neat nod to fans of the animation show, but you should have used it to summon a good first boss instead. The only supposedly new skill is his call for help, ordering the most fearsome creature in the Kirby universe onto the battlefield. Waddle these. As much as I would love to praise the idea of incorporating his servants directly into the fight, this is one of those classic Kirby boss moments where you will probably never even see the ability in action, because Dedede goes down too fast. It doesn't help that he's basically stunned whenever you attack, rendering the confrontation obsolete with certain copy abilities. Normally I quite enjoy the idea of using a Dedede confrontation as a prologue. Sometimes the story needs time to get going and it's a perfect excuse to construct a duel without a serious tone or having to rely on outdated possession plots. This is why I've chosen Squeak Squad Dedede to be the last place. Regarding how many titles the series already consisted of at the time of Squeak Squad's release, getting such a basic battle without any inspired touches was rather disappointing, and it stands in stark contrast to the genuinely well-crafted boss fights the game otherwise offers. Just like in Squeak Squad, Dedede's portrayal in Nightmare in Dreamland isn't per se bad, but it suffers from an issue you've probably noticed. I'm only referring to the remake. I would like to briefly highlight the strongest aspect of this fight, because there's really only one standout feature. As the first Kirby entry on the Game Boy Advance, sprite work for Dedede is incredibly detailed and conveys far more expression than it's often given credit for. The GBA era of Kirby is one of the most visually pleasing, and small touches like Dedede's shocked face whenever he takes damage enhances the dorky presentation of his character that the creators were likely aiming for from the beginning. It's a shame I can't praise the battle itself in the same way, as there are quite a few downsides compared to the original. While the fight itself remains unchanged, everything else has been altered to create an easier and therefore more boring fake final boss. Compared to Adventure, Dedede is slower, more predictable and bigger, making him less challenging to hit. Whenever I return to the original, I'm often surprised by how tough Dedede actually was, even when using a copy ability. This isn't surprising considering the franchise's gradual shift towards being not only easier but also more accessible, and while I may make it sound more dramatic than it is, since this is merely a prelude to the real climax, I still wish Nightmare in Dreamland had at least maintained the fast pace instead of being just a pretty fountain without any sparkle. Kirby's Toy Box is without a doubt the most obscure entry in the series and was never released outside of Japan. I admittedly didn't care enough to track down a proper playable build, so you will have to settle for screenshots instead. I'll spare you a lengthy history lesson on the game's background, but Kirby's Toy Box was released for the Satellaview, a satellite-based add-on for the Super Nintendo that allowed players in Japan to download games and other digital content through satellite broadcasts. Toybox itself was one such release and consists of 8 short minigames, one of which features a rudimentary Dedede boss fight. In Starbreak, the player has to juggle Kirby across the screen, breaking stars and collecting them to prevent the timer from reaching 0. At the end, Dedede appears floating around the screen and throwing hammers at the player. The only real challenge comes from the fact that there is no way to replenish your time during this encounter, though Dedede himself goes down after only a few hits, and the overall time limit is extremely generous. Judging this fight by any imaginable metric would be about as pretentious as seriously evaluating the culinary craftsmanship of noodles with ketchup, and it's not like the fight does anything particularly wrong within its simplistic gameplay. The mere fact that there is some kind of boss battle at all is already surprisingly ambitious, and despite never having played it myself, the encounter tells enough of a story just by looking at it. The sound Dedede makes whenever he gets hit is already more favorable than the previous 2 rankings. The first spin-off in the series naturally had to be a pinball game. Built primarily from Dreamland's assets, everything here feels like a direct extension of Kirby's first adventure. From the regular enemies to the returning bosses, Dedede now drops bombs and casts magic spells, reworked to fit the pinball gameplay, while still using his classic ability to inflate himself to move around the battlefield. In Dreamland we mostly saw Dedede from a side profile, so this new frontal perspective was a great opportunity to showcase his relatively complex pixel design from different angles. The way he dances to the music, intentionally or not, adds an amusing tone, and one concept I particularly enjoy about the early days of the franchise, where rules and abilities of characters are not definitely defined, are the random skills Dedede performs. Throwing bombs may be plausible in some ways, but nonsensically using lightning bolts with his hands is certainly a technique you don't link to Dedede. Not implying I don't enjoy it, quite the contrary actually. It hinders the flippers from moving and therefore interacts with the actual character you control in a pinball game. Since Kirby's flying all over the place, it isn't as detrimental as it sounds, but still the kind of mechanical rug pull you wish to see from a final brawl. Some might say the most important parts of a game are the beginning and the ending, as they need to provide a reason to keep playing or leave the lasting impression. Exhilarating boss fights often serve as the perfect setup for a climactic moment, even if the game itself doesn't require one. Because of that, many titles include at least a final boss, even when the rest of the game lacks significant boss encounters. This concept applies to nearly every genre, even minor spin-offs such as Kirby's Dream Course, the first side game on a home console. Conceptualizing convincing enemy encounters in a golf game turns out to be quite complicated, which is why many games choose to forego them entirely. I don't mean this in a negative way. If a game lacks boss fights because they wouldn't enhance the gameplay or simply aren't necessary, that's perfectly fine. Despite this, Kirby's Dream Course does include a final boss, and it's just as rudimentary as expected. Push the giant robot Dedede a few times before he gets too close and avoid the smaller Dededes by timing your jumps correctly. If everything goes smoothly, the battle will be over in less than a minute, ending with a visually gratifying explosion. I doubt anyone is overly concerned with whether Dream Course Dedede ranks above or below other early franchise spin-offs, and I can fully admit that my appreciation comes down to the fact that he pilots a cool looking mech. They could have just made him taller, but instead they designed an entire mechanical contraption, and you have to admire the effort. It's also the first time Dedede pilots a giant robot, something the franchise occasionally revisits. I have no idea who suggested putting Dedede in a robot for a minor golf spin-off, but I would like to see this specific rendition make a return someday. After pinball, breakout-style gameplay was naturally the next step, and it really highlights the advantage of having a protagonist who's essentially a simple sphere and silhouette. What might sound like just another superficial spin-off designed to make a quick profit is actually surprisingly robust in its content, mechanics and overall ambition. Copy abilities are included, and there's an impressive number of boss fights, many of which cleverly reimagine established characters. They even had the nerve to hide the final boss, King Dedede, behind specific conditions, just like in Dreamland 2 for instance. For a harmless breakout clone, Dedede can be surprisingly difficult. Swallowing Kirby only to spit him back out disrupts your rhythm, while his bomb attacks carry over from Pinball Land. But the biggest surprise is an actual gun. So that's why he's a hidden final boss, briefly stunning every side of the field. Again, the franchise was still developing its identity at this point, so not every Dedede encounter featured his now iconic theme. Blockball's soundtrack is, based on age, generally overlooked, but Dedede's new theme perfectly complements the chaotic nature the battle is accompanied by. Yet another experimental spin-off, this Game Boy Color title utilized early rudimentary motion control technology, sometimes making you want to throw your Game Boy out of frustration. Or your GameCube. Fortunately, the Switch version offers a modern re-release with controller support and save states, providing a more accessible entrance. The motion controls themselves aren't bad, but they can clash with unforgiving tight level design. Perhaps this is also why the bosses are comparably easy and don't require pinpoint precision, since implementing meaningful fights in such a restricted gameplay environment must have been challenging. Most of them feel the same: an eyeball, another eyeball, and an eyeball in a cloud. Might as well be a Zelda game. At least the final boss, King Dedede, doesn't rehash any previous ideas and instead relies on a cannon as your primary means of attack. The only motion control required is guiding Kirby towards Dedede after each shot, which is manageable given the short distance between them. Occasionally Dedede swallows his star, visibly powering up and throwing his hammer in defense. Once his shield breaks, he throws a tantrum, wildly running around and showcasing a surprising amount of charm and expressiveness for a Game Boy Color title. The way he simply strolls onto the battlefield with no grand entrance, followed followed by Kirby comforting him after the fight, feels like an amusingly clumsy attempt at initiating the battle and transitioning to the credits properly. You are the final boss, at least jump from the ceiling or something, behaves like I just knocked on his door. There are definitely tougher bosses within the same game, but lowering the difficulty for the final battle was probably the right choice, considering how frustrated some players, not me, could be at that point. The last level already had its fair share of laborious moments, and throwing in another demanding dexterity test just before the ending could have left a sour taste. This approach allows players to appreciate the colorful sprite work, the slightly altered yet still recognizable Dreamland DDD theme, and the nostalgic presentation reminiscent of classics like the Zelda Oracle games.
King Dedede.
Kirby's Avalanche, the game where Kirby actually talks, serves as the obligatory Puyo Puyo spin-off that every successful franchise seems to get at least once back in the day. You battle a series of traditional Kirby enemies, with brief cutscenes that are often cited as the main reason this game is remembered at all. The awkward voice acting and clunky dialogue are so bad, they cross into that oddly entertaining territory where it almost feels like an average Jürgen wrote and dubbed the entire game. Let me paint a lovely portrait of you losing to me, ha ha ha. This game's banter is better than any Marvel movie. Oh, what a mess, I must clean up this entire forest. I would worry more about cleaning up your avalanche skills first. I take that back, this game's dialogue is great. The Dream Fountain Cup will be mine. Welcome DDD and good luck to you. Welcoming the final boss, the audacity. The battles simply increase in difficulty without introducing any notable gameplay mechanics. This isn't a true Puyo Puyo and Kirby crossover. It's just a standard Puyo Puyo copycat with a light Kirby reskin. So if you're a Puyo Puyo fan, you will likely be satisfied. But don't expect any distinct Kirby themed gimmicks, you'll need to play Superstar Stacker for that. Even so, there's at least one small gimmick in DDD's battle. The screen shakes whenever his droplets land. There's no deeper impact behind this feature, but it does make the final duel feel a bit more dramatic, and at this point I think I can no longer hide the fact that I ranked Avalanche above other titles just because it was funny. The remake of Star Stacker never released outside of Japan, but finally made its debut in the West thanks to Nintendo Switch Online, albeit without a proper translation. A Tetris-inspired spin-off doesn't require much reading comprehension, but Superstar Stacker still might be one of the most unfamiliar entries in the series for many fans. The gameplay speaks for itself, blending classic Tetris mechanics with a distinct Kirby touch. In fact, it's probably one of my favorite early Kirby spin-offs that builds upon another iconic trendsetter. A big part of its appeal is the charming art style, which draws inspiration from Dreamland 3 and gives the game the signature Kirby flair that can feel lacking in other, more blatant Tetris clones. Including this game as a proper DDD encounter is already a stretch, and it only gets worse, just wait for the next placement. But since Superstar Stacker features a story mode with duels against classic Kirby characters, I have to count it. Each duel progressively increases in difficulty, introducing only minor twists to keep things interesting. DDD serves as the final regular boss, testing everything you've learned while starting the match with a bunch of hard blocks to overcome. However, the real standout is the music, acting as a precursor to the masked DDD's theme, and sounding far more ambitious than it has any right to be. At the end of the day, it's still just a Tetris clone, and there isn't much boss action to speak of. Still, compared to other early spin-offs that ranked lower, Superstar Stacker won me over with its intuitive mechanics, and a splendid Kirby aesthetic that makes it feel more like a true Kirby game than the original source material it is built after. Also, DDD just casually shoots down Kirby's companion in this game, causing him to split apart. It is beyond me why people wouldn't want this kind of scummy, over-exaggerated DDD back in the mainline titles, but it's the random moments like these that make the stories of these older games all the funnier. The number of placements should have already given it away, but we're including absolutely every DDD snuggle, even the most insignificant battle in a small mini-game. Mass Attack is not only famous for being largely forgotten after releasing at a time when the follow-up handheld console was already on the market, but also for containing a plethora of surprisingly enjoyable mini-games, a classic trademark of the series. Some might even say they're more engaging than the actual game itself thanks to their simple premises and a few unexpected cameos. One of those mini-games is Kirby Quest, a particularly memorable side endeavor that offers a light attempt at a Kirby RPG. You battle waves of enemies by timing a button press at just the right moment for maximum damage. Filling the experience bar grants you additional Kirbys, increasing your strength and preparing you for a special boss at the end. One reoccurring boss is DDD, and while every confrontation is essentially the same but stronger, there is not much that makes the fight itself particularly special. However, as I mentioned, it's the Easter eggs that give Kirby Quest DDD this ranking. Not only does he pile pilot the giant robot seen in the trailer for the cancelled GameCube title, but in some instances Dedede's attacks are also accompanied by Escargoon himself. It might seem a little criminal to rank such a frivolous battle above basically anything else, but the combination of my low expectations for a short minigame and the surprising amount of care put into pleasing fans of the animation show feeds my bias and makes me unwilling to try and justify this placement any further. Placing Adventure Dedede low in the ranking probably says more than enough about my stance on the game. As someone who never grew up with nor played through Adventure for a long time, I have no nostalgia for this admittedly franchise-defining title, though I can certainly appreciate what is accomplished for the series' future. In fact, when I first tried its remake back then, I had no idea it was even based on an earlier classic. There were no established traditions yet, meaning anything could have happened during the climax. Facing Dedede as the final boss was entirely plausible, and the only hint that there might be more to the story lies in the battle itself. It's nearly identical to Dreamland, with just one noticeable new move. This second encounter feels somewhat anticlimactic for the franchise's grand home console debut. In hindsight though, it makes sense. I would even argue that this adds to the whole scenario as it plays into the classic video game trope of a former final boss now serving as merely an appetizer. Cynical voices might say this undermines Dedede as a character and a threat, but it actually reinforces his role, causing harmless trouble in Dreamland while also recognizing real danger as seen in his attempt to stop Kirby from freeing Nightmare. What's more is the beautiful setting, which provides a striking contrast to the previous battle arena and went on to become one of Smash's most famous stages for a good reason. Given that Adventure was the first game to colorize Dreamland, it's a gorgeous sight to behold. While the phrase acceptable for what it tries to achieve, Adventure Dedede still feels a little too safe and could have benefited from one or two additional moves. Just like many other battles in the lower ranks, there are often only a few, if not just one small detail that set them apart. Superstar consists of multiple short adventures, each with its own rules but tied together by a common narrative thread. One of these modes is Spring Breeze, a sort of remake of the original Dreamland for the Game Boy. Beyond a graphical overhaul and colorful reinterpretation of the once black and white opening to the series, Spring Breeze introduces a major feature that completely changes the pace of the original: copy abilities. Although former director Sakurai initially pushed for Kirby to remain unable to inhale abilities in Spring Breeze, they were ultimately included, likely for a more cohesive gameplay experience across all modes. The reason I bring this up are the boss fights, which were not originally designed with copy abilities in mind. In this pseudo-remake, bosses go down much faster and more easily, thanks to the player's ability to deal damage consistently whenever they choose, rather than waiting for projectiles or star bits to inhale. I wouldn't necessarily call this a downgrade, as it's simply another way to experience the original Dreamland, and Superstar doesn't rely on Spring Breeze to shape your overall opinion of the game. However, this also explains why Superstar Dedede ranks relatively low, as the battle is over in mere seconds. Now, circling back to the specific detail that sets this fight apart from the others, one major upgrade the original received is the battlefield itself. The sense of a true showdown was amplified significantly, with an actual audience and other prominent figures making an appearance this time. I can imagine the original tried to achieve a similar setup but was limited by hardware constraints. It's always enjoyable to see how aged titles can flourish in line with their initial vision, thanks to new hardware opportunities. Although it's an ancient convention for the IP at this point, Crystal Shards presents one of the earlier instances of Dedede being mind-controlled by a higher entity. You would think he would have grown accustomed to being tricked by dark matter after the events of prior games, but given the overwhelming influence of the powerful substance and his admittedly simplistic mind, it's not too surprising to see yet another possessed battle. Atop his newly designed castle awaits the third tutorial boss. Following a battle design reminiscent of Dreamland 3, the fight itself sticks closely to the same formula, with a relatively uneventful first phase before shifting into an airborne second phase with more dynamic moves. In contrast to Dreamland 3, however, the timing of these battles differs significantly. Dedede in Kirby 64 is more of an introduction, whereas his Dreamland 3 counterpart once again fulfills the role of a prelude to the final showdown. As a result, the difficulty naturally varies, but this isn't my main issue with this duel. Adeline's battle is similarly easy, takes place just one level earlier, and essentially mirrors Dedede's role in Dreamland 3. The difference is, her fight is is far more engaging, diverse, and better adapted to the relatively slow pace of the crystal shards, using uniquely paced mini-boss encounters to keep each phase fresh. The same cannot be said for Kirby 64's Dedede, who moves drastically slowly, giving players all the time in the world to dodge. And if you have a copy ability or worse, a copy combination, the brawl ends in an instant, without even getting to see most of the attacks you remember from Dreamland 3. So while I just nitpicked enough to justify placing this battle at the bottom, I still have to acknowledge that it's only one of 3 tutorial fights. Considering that the main highlight of these battles is seeing beloved characters animated in 3D for the first time, paired with the charming cutscenes before and after the fight, this encounter still manages to rank relatively high among less outstanding clashes. One of the battles you wouldn't normally count, but it says versus King Dedede right there, and I'm somewhat of a literal guy. Although he's a playable character in the main racing mode, Dedede makes an appearance during City Trial at the end of a round as part of the final minigames. Here all contestants must work together to take down the oversized ruler of Dreamland, using whatever items have dropped on the flat arena. If time runs out, everyone fails. From a gameplay perspective, there isn't much of a battle. Dedede simply drives around the field and only strikes back when you cross his path. He gets faster as his health decreases, but otherwise it's an extremely simple challenge with no real twist. I do appreciate the novelty of a challenge where everyone has to work together, creating an all or nothing situation, but in practice the showdown is so chaotic that players usually just throw out their items and abilities without any regard if it works. Not that it's a bad thing. Often the minigames with no clear tensions, which play into our barbaric instincts, turn out to be the most amusing, and if you manage to strike the final blow, it gives you the impression that you were the MVP, no matter how much you contributed. But despite all those little intricacies, it's something else that secures this Dedede's place. Keeping my heavy nostalgia in mind, the combination of the impactful music, darkened atmosphere and the huge Dedede driving around left a lasting impression on me as a child. When I saw the headline, versus King Dedede, it felt so serious, making me far more tense than any other minigame. Airride has this unique ability to capture the spirit it wants to convey, whether through its slightly aged but colorful visuals or most importantly, its outstanding soundtrack. Driving through Celestial Valley just after gliding over Beanstalk Park is a strong contrast and proves the game's artistic touch, showing that it knew exactly which vibe to evoke. The same goes for City Trial, which features random events that lead to a tonal shift depending on how urgent the situation becomes. You might have a round where nothing significant happens, but if you manage to build one of the legendary machines at the last second and walk straight into a battle against Dedede, no matter how useless those machines are in that scenario, you still get the impression that the fight is won before it even starts. And even if you get smacked and ultimately destroyed, Airride really makes you feel defeated with its powerful sound design and dramatic death animation. Leaving players impressed by distracting them from throwing their controllers. I could go on and embellish something that some people wouldn't even count as a battle, but I just wrote a whole page about Airride Dedede. Jumping from one spin-off to the next, Canvas Curse takes a far more creative approach in crafting a scenario that fits better not only the DS's unique features, but also its own gameplay identity. While it's possible to design a traditional boss fight with a classic health bar, much like the final boss of the same game, it doesn't fully capture what it means to embrace such a distinct playstyle and its potential for boss designs. I'm not suggesting that Droxia or any of Rainbow Curse's bosses fail at delivering memorable moments. They essentially prove the rule, and in Droxia's case in particular, she creates a clear contrast to the other gimmicky bosses by standing out as the only traditional one. Ironically, she could be considered the true gimmick boss, since all the other make far greater use of the DS stylus, just like Dedede. Reminiscent of the classic gourmet race, it's time for another competition. Gather as much food as possible and reach the finish line first. In this case, it's not about collecting the most items, but about using every single one to build up speed, allowing you to break through blocks and enemies without taking damage. The drawn line effectively becomes Kirby, removing the need to control both elements separately. Wherever you touch the screen, Kirby follows, and combined with a fast-paced movement, it can become quite hectic to keep track of what lies ahead. This is also the main reason for its lower ranking, as I often don't feel fully in control of what's happening. There are no real flaws in the gameplay as such, but I would argue that at a certain point, especially on higher difficulties, the screen becomes so crowded that it's nearly impossible to anticipate patterns. After a while, I found myself simply moving up and down, hoping to catch food at random and come out on top. It's also important to note that nearly every regular boss in Canvas Curse suffers from the same issue, increasing difficulty by simply stacking the odds against the player. This might also explain why the developers returned to more traditional fights in Rainbow Curse. Though I still appreciate the attempt. I'm all for experimenting with ideas that may not be possible to revisit in the future due to hardware limitations. And during a standard playthrough, most players likely won't even encounter this issue. One aspect that deserves particular praise, however, is the music. Canvas Curse's soundtrack may be somewhat divisive due to its unusual direction, but much like the gameplay, I appreciate its distinct identity and the recognizable DS sound font. The composers could have opted for a safe remix of DDD's iconic theme, which would have worked perfectly well given the game's peculiar melodic style, but instead we get a familiar yet reworked arrangement that adapts certain sections to match the fast-paced nature of the battle. It still clearly echoes DDD's leitmotif, yet it feels like an alternate or even previously scrapped version the composers always wanted to explore, but I imagine it's quite challenging to preserve such a memorable tune while reinventing it at the same time, which ultimately adds to this DDD battle being one of the better gimmick encounters. Together with DDD Drum Dash, Fighters Deluxe represents another instance of Kirby spin-offs expanding upon a short side mode from a mainline title. It takes the multiplayer-focused concept from Triple Deluxe and builds upon it with additional copy abilities, arenas and boss fights. Given its status as a digital-only eShop release, expecting the same level of quality as the mainline entries would be unrealistic. At the end of the campaign awaits King DDD, or rather Team DDD 64. I suppose there isn't much of a deeper explanation behind this fight. DDD just randomly splits himself into multiple smaller versions, taking turns as they join the arena. It's actually reminiscent of Planet Robobot's DDD rendition. The fight itself doesn't become particularly challenging due to this gimmick, but there's a certain satisfaction in smacking away multiple DDDs without much resistance. It carries its own entertaining value, separated from pure gameplay or difficulty, and cannot be explained by theoretical game design norms. Sometimes it's just fun to bash countless foes, as if they are flies and be an unstoppable force. Sectonia can sing a song. The second phase is your classic DDD fight. He becomes bigger after some while and is accompanied by two weirdly orange companions. I'm sure someone made a video about their origin. For moderately enhanced eShop only release on the 3DS, you get what you expect, and I appreciate every spin-off taking the chance to have DDD as the final boss. Similar to Adventure, DDD substitutes as the fake final boss in Dreamland 2, but unlike Adventure, he remains the final boss unless you achieve 100% completion. This feature, later exploited in many future titles, made its mainline debut here. The original Dreamland already provided a fairly demanding struggle, and Dreamland 2 follows suit by replicating most of DDD's moves one-to-one. However, in contrast to Adventure, which benefited from the NES home console's capabilities, the Game Boy's smaller screen limits your space, requiring quicker reaction times to navigate the fight effectively. Copy abilities help balance the difficulty by allowing the player to deal consistent damage rather than waiting for starbits to inhale. This might seem like an easy advantage, but Dreamland 2 actually gives both playstyles distinct strengths and weaknesses. Copy abilities encourage a more offensive tactic, but generally deal less damage than a well-aimed starbit. Additionally, unlike later entries, abilities lack complex movesets, often offering just a single clunky attack that isn't always optimal for every situation. This trade-off adds a layer of strategy, making the choice between inhaling and using abilities more meaningful. After some time, DDD enters a rage mode, displaying more aggressive behavior and unleashing powerful crash attacks. This is a surprisingly effective, likely low-budget way to make the iteration of DDD stand out, while still offering a satisfying conclusion for players who don't reach the true final battle. Unlike typical rage phases that trigger only when a boss is near defeat, Dreamland 2 DDD shifts in and out of this mode unpredictably. Meanwhile, the inconspicuous sleep symbols appearing above him hint that something isn't quite right, subtly suggesting that there is more to this fight than meets the eye. I wouldn't mind if future Kirby titles require players to meet specific conditions to unlock the true ending again, although it does carry the risk of some people missing out on the proper conclusion. It adds mystery, encourages more thoughtful play, and gives younger players the opportunity to share their theories about what might be hidden behind 100% completion. Somewhat forgotten, but all the more important, is Blowout Blast, which marks the first proper attempt to bring the Kirby formula into 3D before the Forgotten Land was released. As an eShop only title on the 3DS, it's understandable why Blowout Blast was mostly played by dedicated fans. Despite the game being as simplistic as it gets, missing out on copy abilities entirely, the bosses received an unexpected amount of care and attention to detail. There aren't many of them, and the ones we do fight are mainly opponents from the original Dreamland, reinforcing the idea that Blowout Blast is essentially a literal translation of Dreamland into 3D. It's similar to how Mario 3D Land took traditional 2D elements and shifted them into strict 3D, without any reinterpretations or like one of those YouTube videos titled "I made something but in 3D." The bosses we do get make the most out of the game's limited possibilities. With no copy abilities or overpowered dodge roll, the combat is streamlined to the absolute minimum, prioritizing positioning and good timing. Dedede returns to his original role as the final boss, using all the techniques we've come to appreciate. Naturally, it would have been a little disappointing to face a plain short Dedede, and the creators are well known for going all out, even with the most insignificant titles. When you defeat Dedede, he gets that Bowser juice and transforms into a giant form, creating an appropriately dramatic climax. All of this would have been more than enough, but since I titled this entry basically Dreamland in 3D, there has to be a challenging extra mode. The color palette changes and bosses become more aggressive, an appreciated extension to make the pocket money you spend worthwhile. We even receive a little nod to Dreamland's ending with Dedede striking the same over-the-top expression. Even so, the true highlight remains the comeback of Masked Dedede, something I haven't anticipated for a spin-off like that. Once again, every attack is slightly enhanced, but this time the mask actually plays a vital role. Regular projectiles can't break through it, forcing you to inhale multiple stars for a stronger counterattack. No other boss manipulates the number of star bits you inhale in this way, giving the final a well-earned sense of power while showcasing the creator's talent in making the most out of limited mechanics, just like in Dreamland. We often remember the big moments, but it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly where certain elements of a Dedede battle first left their mark on the series. While Dreamland's foundation is still used to this day and Masked Dedede's debut is widely recognized, Dreamland 3's version of Dedede doesn't receive nearly as much credit as it deserves. As a follow-up to Dreamland 2, many of his moves remain largely the same, which also applies to the overall setup of him appearing to be the final boss. The true spotlight, on the other hand, begins in the second phase, a now standard concept that was effectively introduced here. Dedede hovers above the arena, using his belly to fire dark projectiles or lunge at Kirby. Without the copy ability, the fight becomes surprisingly troublesome, forcing you to constantly switch sides and time each counterattack precisely. It can feel repetitive at times, as Dedede relies on the same two moves over and over, but it's hard to deny the influence this encounter has had on future battles. Whenever a dark, mirror or otherwise evil Dedede counterpart appears, it typically draws from Dreamland 3's template as the foundation for its moveset. And while that template has been heavily expanded over time, it remains distinctively recognizable. The image of Dedede turning his belly into a mouth is so reoccurring that you almost forget how bizarre it actually is. Another aspect worth mentioning is the setting. When playing through Dreamland 3 normally, the battlefield feels very similar to Dreamland 2, distinct thanks to its art style, but not quite unique enough to stand on its own. This changes in the boss rush mode, where each battle takes place in a slightly altered version of the original arena. Most of these are clear improvements, staying true to their roots while adding just enough variation to make a second encounter feel worthwhile. The same applies to Dedede, whose battlefield offers one of the most striking contrasts, shifting from an ominous dark horizon to a vividly colorful blossom. At first this may seem out of place given what follows, but isn't that part of Dreamland 3's charm? The game's subtly unsettling atmosphere paired with occasional somber music and imagery. The contrast between the lurking presence of dark matter and the bright, vibrant tone of the franchise highlights just how much a simple shift in atmosphere can achieve. Jan Dedede holds a unique position, appearing in a spin-off that approaches boss design in a more traditional manner. Whereas Kirby bosses can typically be damaged at any time and feature visible health bars, Epic Yarn follows a more classic platformer structure, requiring players to hit bosses a set number of times, usually 3. Consequently, Epic Yarn's main opponents feel quite different from those in the rest of the series, and ironically adhere to a very standardized formula that Kirby games don't usually rely on. While this alone would already be enough reason to include Dedede as a boss, I haven't mentioned the game's distinctive art style, which turns every character into a hollow Yarn counterpart of themselves. Like everyone else, Dedede is pulled into the Yarn world and wanders through the fourth world aimlessly, only to be possessed by a strange object that controls him like a mindless puppet. Kirby's goal isn't necessarily to defeat Dedede directly, but to free him from the strings. What I particularly enjoy about the setup is that we are not really fighting Dedede himself, but rather overcoming an indirect adversary that uses him as a vessel. A similar idea appears with DDD in Triple Deluxe, though in Epic Yarn's case, you directly target the strange object controlling him, so DDD doesn't need to be fully incapacitated to return to normal. The strategy itself is admittedly simple. You repeatedly stomp his back whenever he slides in, aiming to reach the controlling object above. However, the stomp ability is rarely required elsewhere in the game, especially in boss fights, so I appreciate its inclusion here at least once in a more dynamic encounter. The same can be said for the fight as a whole. None of the individual moves are anything we haven't seen before, but the combination of abilities, along with the requirement of 4 health points instead of the usual 3 hits, makes Yarn DDD quite solid. While I do wish he had at least one standout attack, similar to Squashini's Bomb Trap, it's hard to point to any real shortcomings when everything else works quite well. Nothing about Yarn DDD truly stands out on a broader scale, yet considering Epic Yarn's unique gameplay style and strong foundation, it remains a fight I enjoy every time I revisit the spin-off. It may seem unfair to rank the very first fight against DDD so high compared to the more elaborated encounters we get today, but I prefer to judge each battle within the context of its release, rather than by modern standards. As an accessible Game Boy title, Dreamland set out to appeal to inexperienced players, in a gaming landscape dominated by far more demanding experiences, building every aspect around introducing newcomers to the medium. The playtime is short, the controls are intuitive, and the character design is broadly appealing. You wouldn't normally associate Dreamland with technical ambition, but that perception shifts when you compare to other Game Boy titles at the time. Few games on the system feature character sprites, animations, or enemy variety of comparable complexity. For a Game Boy release, Dreamland is surprisingly impressive, relying on clever techniques to expand both the expressiveness of its world and the range of its enemy designs. Wispy Woods, for instance, is essentially a background tree with a simple face composed of repeated shapes, while Krakow's perfectly symmetrical design allows developers to create one half and mirror it to complete the whole. The reason I bring this up is to establish a standard that might otherwise go unnoticed. As Kirby's first main antagonist, DDD naturally serves as the final boss of the franchise's origin, and interestingly, this is the only time that happened in the mainline titles. Despite the game's age, Dreamland has had a lasting influence on the series, with countless elements still traceable today. Nearly all of DDD's core traits carry over into his modern design, from tripping over his own feet to his high jumps and the iconic hammer. Compared to the bosses encountered earlier in Dreamland, DDD is more complex, durable, and ultimately engaging, clearly reflecting the developer's intent to make the final stand out. The contrast is especially effective after defeating the simpler bosses beforehand, reinforcing the sense that the climax was meant to feel distinct and elevated. That said, the variety of his attacks doesn't stem from technical complexity alone, but from how efficiently those limitations are used. Moves like tripping along the way add enchantment we enjoy today, and it must have been once again a difficult task to give your key figure's character with a limited hardware and missing proper colors. On top of that, since there are no copy abilities to swallow yet, dealing consistent damage was not a thing, making the fight longer, harder, and requiring you to act appropriately to whatever sudden skill DDD uses. For a Game Boy title, the final is clearly quite impressive and deserves the attention for the legacy it created. As we are slowly approaching the top 10, you might be wondering why Return to Dreamland is included here. As part of the now iconic lineup of Kirby, Bandana D, Meta Knight, and DDD, you will hardly find a fight that resembles a modern take on the classic rivalry. There's no evil counterpart or possession scenario either, only the 4-player group dynamic. Since the usual tropes are absent, the game instead leans on a different idea. After a brief visit to the ship you're trying to repair, you unlock 2 minigames that offer an alternative way to showcase something for me to include in this video. Scope Shot makes use of the Wii Remote's motion controls, placing you in the comfortable position of simply pointing at obstacles and shooting them down. You face a robotic version of familiar Kirby characters, equipped with significantly more health and multiple weak points to keep the encounter engaging. The true highlight and the reason it earns a spot on this list is Robo DDD, a short but noteworthy battle that raises an interesting question about what the game considers a boss. While Robo DDD doesn't appear in the boss rush, the Lore Star Cutter battle is essentially a side-scrolling minigame as well, which is why I chose to include this mechanical counterpart too. At the start of the fight, there isn't much variation compared to earlier rounds within the same minigame. The enemy is simply faster, stronger, and takes longer to defeat. The only notable addition is the Time Bomb, which bounces back and forth until it explodes on either your side or the opponent's. It plays out like a simple Mario Party minigame and for once doesn't rely on constant shooting, but instead on timing the odds in your favor. It's a shame that Scope Shot was inexplicably removed in the remake, leaving behind only a small appearance as a downgraded substitute in Egg Catcher. Do you think I should count that as a boss too? This battle holds a special place in my heart as it feels like the ultimate fan service made just for me. After defeating Dark Taranza and Team Kirby Clash, already a cathartic moment for anyone who wished for a proper Taranza fight in Triple Deluxe, a fusion of Shadow Dedede and Dark Mind named King D Mind, sounds like a gangster rapper, rises from the Dark Mirror. The irony behind this combination is obvious. Merging Dedede, who never appeared in the Amazing Mirror, with that game's final boss is a brilliantly unexpected twist, especially for such a minor expansion of a side mode. We get the best of both worlds as this dark fusion combines the abilities of both characters in a tough battle if you're not prepared. The belly chomp returns and Dark Mind's signature eyeball shoots lasers just like in the old days. Not to mention the stylishly evil design, which incorporates the mask design from Dark Mind's magician form while adding the necessary intimidation factor with a jet hammer. Just like in Triple Deluxe, he falls back on a giant halberd during the second phase. And this leads to my main issue with an otherwise fantastic battle. It's technically nothing new. That's not too surprising considering it's from a minor eShop only release that doesn't have the budget of a mainline title. Plus it's understandable that creating a proper Taranza battle took higher priority. But ultimately everything King D Mind does is either carried over from Triple Deluxe or reminiscent of past attacks we have seen countless times. I do fully appreciate the extreme fan service for players like me and I'm not asking for anything unrealistic. I just have to fairly acknowledge why this otherwise unforgettable battle falls short of breaking into the top 10. This battle holds a special place in my heart as it feels like the ultimate fan service made just for my dementia. Yeah, it's essentially the same fight I just described but in HD. King HD Mind gets a new color palette and only minor differences from the original. Most of Super Kirby Clash's content was directly carried over from its predecessor and I've already had my fair share of Amazing Mirror pandering. Despite this, one interesting detail you might not be aware of is King D Mind's revenge insanely high HP. It's actually the highest of any boss in the entire series due to the game's RPG elements. Still, it reinforces the image of him as an absolute tank. And after Margolos' epilogue hinted at a connection between Super Kirby Clash's universe and the mainline Kirby timeline, it's kinda wild to think that all these parallel versions we fight in Super Kirby Clash might actually be the strongest characters in the entire series. Air Riders was the reason I had to delay this video so much with not only one but two distinct Dedede type clashes. Ironically, none of them are Dedede himself. And Noir Dedede portrays the rival character you face throughout the game's story mode. He's basically a personified challenge defined by the game's specific genre. Kart racers are fairly limited in what they can do in terms of proper boss fights, which is why similar genre contemporaries regularly resort to mere racers against slightly more intimidating opponents. This is what Noir Dedede does. You either beat him in an air ride, top ride or city trial challenge. And for what Noir Dedede is supposed to be, it works perfectly fine. Having a couple other proper boss fights in Air Riders makes him surprisingly distinct, despite the limited nature of the controls. The only true unique confrontation is race against him at the end of Road Trip. But ultimately, Noir Dedede is just a rearrangement of challenges you're completing the whole campaign. So it's basically other reasons outside the fights justifying the higher ranking as well. The design looks plainly cool and at least they did go the extra mile and gave the playable build whole new animations and a different jump in comparison to regular Dedede. The wheelie bike Noir Dedede rides cannot be unlocked because the striking dark vehicle is not one of a kind. You receive all the parts, colors and accessories to build the Noir bike for yourself, which you have probably already seen when visiting the machine market. Not only is Noir Dedede a stylish looking character that challenges your skills in every major mode beyond mere NPCs, he also subtly incentivized to try out my machine and copy his bike. Mass Attack may not be a particularly well-known Kirby game, and Dedede's role in it isn't especially important, but anyone who dismisses it for its gimmicky gameplay is missing out on one of the best bosses in any Kirby spin-off. The premise of controlling multiple Kirbys at once and flicking them to deal damage was unprecedented for the series, making it difficult to compare expectations to those shaped by more traditional titles. The ones included are surprisingly exceptional, making excellent use not only of the unique gameplay, but also of the DS dual screen setup, as one of the last entries to fully embrace the handheld's features at the time when the 3DS was already taking over. It justifies a fitting send-off to mechanics we may never see again. It's only logical to include Dedede as one of the main bosses and see what can be done with the newly promoted ruler of this local holiday resort. Although this video primarily focuses on Dedede encounters, it's important to first understand the broader design philosophy behind Mass Attack's bosses. Each one is built around a specific skill the player learns throughout the game. That might sound a bit exaggerated considering considering how simple and limited the moveset is, mainly carrying all Kirbys at once or flinging them, but the focus isn't just on what the player can do, but instead on what the game demands of him. Sometimes that means breaking walls, managing balance, or positioning the group correctly. In this case, it turns into a small dexterity challenge built around a precise timing. Dedede hovers above the arena, throwing bubble bombs that you must send back to bring him down. It's a straightforward concept for a simple game. Unfortunately, it's less frustrating than it sounds. The game even compensates if you struggle to return the bombs, occasionally prompting Dedede to descend and attack with his hammer. This effectively transitions into the second phase, a faster paced final stretch that ensures the fight ends on a more exciting note. The pacing could seem comparably high, especially when only watching the gameplay, but it's one of those battles that clicks when playing. Throwing bombs perfectly and coming into a rhythm feels fairly rewarding, and your eyes are consistently switching between the screens. And unlike Epic Yarn Dedede, for example, which was fine in itself, but still felt considerably familiar at some moments, Mass Attack Dedede is completely new and inimitable in its execution. I always appreciate a relatively innovative idea that has nothing to do with any prior setup from the past, which is why I do not only treasure Mass Attack as such, but any creative Dedede spin-off battle. I regularly tend to forget about Planet Robobot's Dedede, or more precisely the strange substance resembling him, despite the genuinely creative staging. From the start it was obvious that the game would feature a battle against the king in some form, as it would have been a missed opportunity to not incorporate the robotic theme into one of Kirby's essential rivals. It almost feels like a wasted chance to not reference the giant robot shown in the trailer for the cancelled GameCube Kirby game, but I would rather see a fresh idea than a repeated Easter egg, especially since Return to Dreamland already fulfilled that wish, and Planet Robobot references more than enough established callbacks. Plus, fighting a mere copy instead of the real Dedede feels like a fitting excuse to omit yet another fully fledged appearance while still including him, considering Triple Deluxe already gave Dedede plenty of screen time. The face-off itself is divided into two distinct phases. First, you battle the copy in a rising elevator, with Dedede splitting into multiple replicas. Even though they share a common health bar, each has a limited amount of stamina and isn't defeated at random. As an opening phase, it's a solid introduction, restricting the player's movement by reducing available space. Additionally, the rising elevator builds anticipation for what's to come, lending the atmosphere a sense of escalation and clearly distinguishing the two phases. Typically, and in Planet Robobot's case as well, the second phase raises the difficulty by making the boss more aggressive and adding new or altered attacks. In this situation, the moment-to-moment gameplay completely changes upon reaching the top, giving this fight a uniquely individual touch. I bring this up to highlight the effort put into this battle and to soften my next point. Regardless of how well designed the Dedede's battle mechanics are, one of Planet Robobot's biggest flaws is its bosses, specifically how often they either reuse ideas or recycle entire fights. That's obviously not the case here, but I can't shake the feeling that the developers took the easy route for the first phase, by using Fighters Deluxe concept of multiple Dededes as a blueprint to conserve resources. Given how few people actually played that spin-off, it's an understandable approach, but still an interesting thought and further proof of how impressive Planet Robobot turned out, despite its heavy reliance on recycled elements. Luckily, the second phase is completely original and unveils some clever perspective shifts while ramping up the difficulty by having a giant cannon drift around. One of Planet Robobot's more subtle improvements over Triple Deluxe is its stronger use of dynamic camera angles, something we haven't really seen since Kirby 64. The opening level, along with many other moments, utilizes panoramic shots to emphasize height differences between Kirby and the surroundings, or in some cases, simply to give people like me an excuse to point them out and sound insightful. In any case, it's a thoughtful and subtle addition that enhances bosses more than most developers of 2.5D style platformers realize. Longtime viewers probably saw this high ranking coming, since I've always praised the Amazing Mirror for its unique, never again replicated approach to building one interconnected world without level selection screens. Any form of recognition for it is a welcome surprise. What makes this even better is how Triple Deluxe ties its story so strongly to the Amazing Mirror, almost feeling like a proper stand-in for the lost remake I never received. But putting my personal bias aside, Shadow Dedede wasn't just made for fans like me. The Amazing Mirror is one of the few games in the franchise where the King of Dreamland doesn't appear at all, meaning it never had a chance to introduce a dark counterpart. Triple Deluxe finally fills that gap, giving us a version of Dedede that plays into the game's deeper lore while delivering an exciting, long overdue showdown. It would have been easy for the creators to simply reference Shadow Dedede in hindsight, perhaps in some obscure lore entry or as a similar but forgettable boss. That alone would have been enough to show that they care about the details, but instead Triple Deluxe went all in, giving us a fully fledged boss fight at the end of its post-game. Here the dimension vision mirror reveals DDD's bleak doppelganger, presenting yet another DDD brawl in an already DDD-focused entry. And while this appearance takes place in the post-game, technically making it non-canon to the main story, it fits seamlessly into the lore. The evil mirror has been shown to create twisted reflections of any character, so the idea of a shadow DDD existing somewhere feels entirely believable. So while the fanservice undeniably satisfies longtime fans, the same cannot be said for the battle itself, which keeps it from ranking any higher. That's not to say the boss fight is bad, far from it. Reaching 8th place is still impressive, especially as a post-game battle that should be understood as a bonus, rather than a defining moment for the main adventure. In many ways, Shadow DDD follows the same design philosophy as Dark Meta Knight in The Amazing Mirror, reinforcing an already solid fundament with a handful of new moves, rather than presenting an entirely original boss pitch. A unique theme would have been the perfect cherry on top, but considering how much Triple Deluxe already delivers, it's really hard to seriously complain. More than 10 places later in the ranking, Fighters 2 secures a respectable spot just before the top 5, surpassing Fighters Deluxe by a large margin. A key reason for this contrast is its unique setup. Technically, this isn't solely a battle against DDD, as Meta Knight joins the fight to even the odds. Surprisingly, despite their long-standing rivalry with Kirby, the series had never featured a proper DDD and Meta Knight tag team battle before. The setup itself isn't particularly innovative, but it carries nostalgic weight, bringing the three main characters of the series together for a friendly showdown. And if you choose Head Goomba as your companion, it feels even more familiar. As I have often mentioned in multiple videos, not every game needs demonic gods from hell to create excitement. Sometimes traditional matchups deliver a more distinct and personal atmosphere we sincerely lack in mainline titles. Since this is a budget entry exclusive to the Nintendo eShop, there wasn't much to anticipate in terms of potential. Most of the attacks are simply copied from past iterations, but adjusted to fit the double boss format. And because the game recycles bosses to pad out the roster, the DDD plus Meta Knight fight repeats multiple times while increasing stakes and difficulty each round. As I suggested, the early duels alone wouldn't justify such a high ranking, but they're not disappointing either. They serve their purpose well, but what truly stands out is the moment when DDD tosses a tomato to Meta Knight. It's always fun to see opponents use one of the protagonist's signature items to their advantage, and it reinforces the bond between DDD and Meta Knight. They don't clash in their attacks or miscommunicate at any point. Quite the opposite actually. Their teamwork is surprisingly seamless, especially considering the vastly different character archetypes and overall roles in the franchise. The unexpected yet fitting harmony reaches its peak in the final battle, set against an impressive backdrop with hard to dodge attacks. Instead of regenerating their health with tomatoes, DDD and Meta Knight put on intimidating masks, adding a surprising twist, one of those small yet ambitious details that make these seemingly minor spin-offs stand out. The way they swirl around the battlefield, announced with a Fire Emblem-esque reaction shot, feels incredibly grandiose. You're forced to press yourself against the edge of the arena just to stand a chance at dodging. The only reason this fight is held back from a higher ranking is the personal connection required as a fan. I have to be honest and acknowledge that the fantastic boss fight should stand on its own, even without prior knowledge or nostalgia. Without that emotional attachment, it remains a solid fight, but one that doesn't introduce any groundbreaking mechanics and plays things relatively safe within the limits of the game's production value. Still, I doubt any fan would oppose the idea of a fight like this receiving a proper budget, and even grander execution in a mainline entry, especially when a spin-off battle already shows so much potential. After all, it's hard to not feel something when the credits roll, evoking memories of Revenge of the King and Superstar Ultra. It's a reminder that we need those traditional juxtapositions of established characters from time to time, and despite how friendly DDD has become over the years, he still wants to best his rival at least once. Having DDD as one of the primary characters naturally increases the odds of a high ranking, but Triple Deluxe does an especially convincing job of showcasing how a modern battle against the king can look. Return to Dreamland brought the series back to home consoles, but didn't feature any fights against classic foes like DDD or Meta Knight. Add in the uneventful tutorial battle from Kirby 64, and we haven't seen a proper mainline duel between Kirby and DDD in over 10 years, excluding spin-offs. Triple Deluxe addressed that void, and just like in Dreamland 2 and 3, DDD once again holds the position as the introductory battle before the true final boss. While this might suggest a lesser fight, the ranking speaks for itself. It's anything but. Controlled by Taranza, the first phase blends traditional DDD elements with the return of Mask DDD. However, the absence of the original theme and the rapidly depleting health bar hint at a proper second phase. Then DDD's hammer shatters, the iconic tune kicks in, and surprisingly, the mind-controlled king picks up an own eggs. Simply recycling Mask DDD into a modern fight would have been enough to excite fans, but this extra step elevates nostalgia from a cheap, safe gimmick into something fresh. The attacks become far more intense, the gameplay speeds up, and the difficulty is anything but the warm-up you might expect. When I first experienced the battle, I was a bit disappointed that Taranza didn't play more of an active role, especially since there isn't a dedicated boss fight against him in the first place. But if you take the time to appreciate the action, there's actually a moment where the puppeteer throws magical attacks for DDD to interact with. It's not much and comes far too late into the fight, but it's at least something, resulting in the perfect prologue to one of Kirby's greatest final bosses. After realizing the franchise was shifting towards proper HD platformers, DDD knew he had to step up his game, so he hit the gym. Star Allies DDD is the second boss and the first major encounter at the end of a world. Unlike other early game bosses that played way too safe under the excuse of being an introduction, this version of DDD takes a different approach. While the fight remains appropriately easy, it throws in a surprise in the second half. Initially everything plays out as expected, classic hammer swings, dash attacks, the usual DDD antics. I didn't enjoy the slight change of character design in Triple Deluxe, and while Star Allies is an improvement, his proportions still feel oddly exaggerated. Clearly all those protein shakes took their toll, but once the pre-workout kicks in, the justification for this fight's high placement becomes clear, culminating in the most glorious leg day skipper in gaming media. The powered up DDD smashes the ground, shifting the battle to a new level while fully incorporating the gorgeous background that was previously teased. Massive pillars serve as platforms for DDD to swing around the battlefield, effectively separating Kirby and his allies into different corners. Since Star Allies puts such a strong emphasis on its returning helper mechanic, it's mindful to see a boss that actively tries to counterbalance the player's advantage, instead of simply being overwhelmed by a full team. In practice, regrouping is still incredibly easy, but DDD's relentless movement, hopping around the arena non-stop, helps make the encounter feel more flexible. His oversized arms dominate half the battlefield, and the inclusion of stolen fruit as a ranged attack is a fun touch. On paper, this all sounds exceptionally well executed, but the reality is that the fight remains overwhelmingly easy with a full team of 4. I would certainly reconsider its placement if there was nothing else to add, but just when it seemed like Star Allies was doomed to be a disappointment, the developers delivered one final encore, a last-ditch effort to redeem what was otherwise an underwhelming start to the Switch era. Heroes from Another Dimension features nearly every main boss in an altered form, complete with an unsettling color palette and a brutally steep difficulty curve. And I'm not talking about just a noticeable spike. These are some of the hardest buffed bosses in the entire series. This becomes painfully clear when attempting to clear the arena on the highest difficulty. Shielding attacks drains your health as if you took a direct hit, and trying to fly above enemies is practically impossible when they cover every inch of the screen. Before diving into the real challenge though, there's a neat little Easter egg in the first phase. Normally Smash Bros draws inspiration from Kirby games to create its characters and movesets, but this time it's the other way around. DDD's ability to throw Gordos is a direct nod to Smash, a wholesome tribute to the father of Kirby. When Air Riders was announced, I expected at least all the basic features present in the first installment to return, since the original Air Ride already lacked content back in the day. This includes the superficial boss fight against DDD, and although I wasn't necessarily anticipating an upscaled DDD doing nothing again, it could have been something of that kind. Multiple villains are now playable, so maybe they could have used one of them in a noir DDD styled battle under special rules. Mecha DDD on the other hand is a perfect homage to the original Air Ride, without feeling cheap or draining nostalgia. The boss fight and arena are highly individual, with yet another appreciated take on the mechanical king of Dreamland that I will never be tired of. The animations are incredibly fluid and give the otherwise static build of a robot the amount of life it needs to fit the fast-paced gameplay surrounding it. Unlike DDD and Air Ride, Mecha DDD actually defends himself, uses multiple attacks and transforms into a vehicle once half of his energy is drained. The backside is an important weak point to target, and you can select a control style that either favors free movement or a cinematic angle. Since there are a lot more players attacking the boss at once at the same time, the second phase makes much more sense in freeing Mecha DDD from the shackles of countless attacks. Set a few bombs and practically reset the battle dynamic to give the fight some space to breathe. It's a trope basically every boss in this game uses, and the polish and potential in boss design the original Air Ride failed to properly convey. Air Ride always had far more options for proper boss encounters in comparison to most kart racers due to its copy abilities or aggressive items, and I'm glad Air Riders recognized the promise and, much like the rest of the game, succeeded meeting the boss standard the rest of the series set. While watching this video, some viewers probably dreaded Battle Royale DDD's placement the higher we climbed the ranking. I suppose this is the hot take of the video, but for me, this version of DDD is one of the best and most memorable. The game itself is often forgotten, a somewhat unnecessary minigame collection that was released during the Switch's prime launch year, and got buried alongside many other late 3DS titles. People love to clown on it, and place Battle Royale in an unfavorable light whenever discussing their favorites. Yes, it should have been a Switch title. Yes, it lacked content even for a 3DS full-priced game, but beneath all that is one of the earliest glimpses of a 3D Kirby game before The Forgotten Land came out. Its top-down perspective made it feel closer to a 2D Zelda game at times, but it still provides a sneak peek at how copy abilities could work in 3D, and while the general content was definitely lacking, the developers at least tried to extend the playtime by adding a short campaign, a small but charming addition to an otherwise fun collection of mini-games. The story mode is just a series of contextualized mini-games, but the charming dialogue and unexpectedly pompous DDD ending make it all worth it. After winning his personally organized tournament for a grand cake, DDD refuses to accept yet another humiliating defeat and retreats into the depths of this castle. Following the shadowy path, you soon find yourself face to face with a gigantic robot, piloted by DDD himself. One of the reasons I appreciate the setup so much is how little I expected it to be. From the start, the entire campaign felt like a glorified mini-game rush, so I assumed DDD's final would be just another quick skirmish within that format. Nothing too ambitious. And initially, this is exactly what happens. You fight DDD in a couple rounds until he flees, making you wonder to what extent this game is going to end. Maybe something on the level of Air Ride or, at most, Canvas Curse, but certainly not a full-blown mechanical beast like this. As a longtime fan, it's also just a great callback. Seeing DDD finally piloting a mech himself, as he should have back in the GameCube days, feels like a long overdue moment of redemption. Still, the developers had to get creative with limited resources. A completely new fight with unseen mechanics was likely out of scope, so instead, they focused on making it visually engaging by repurposing ideas from other minigames. Summoning different Kirbys onto the battlefield allows DDD to give you an opportunity to KO them and launch them as projectiles via cannons, just like in the Robo Bonkers minigame. But then ID assisting by handing you the cannon is a neat touch, and while the fight itself is as straightforward as it looks, there's something undeniably nostalgic, seeing DDD as the final boss in such a grandiose way again. Considering the mainline games seem to have no interest in positioning DDD as the main antagonist anymore, I'm glad spin-offs like Battle Royale serve as the perfect excuse to revisit that dynamic. Ranking Battle Royale DDD in third place is completely personal and biased, but if nothing else, this fight deserves its placement for having one of the best arrangements of DDD's theme in the entire series. With Kirby's first proper dive into the third dimension, it wasn't entirely clear how certain elements would translate to 3D. Standard mechanics had to be adjusted to fit the new perspective while still preserving traditions to reassure longtime fans that they were experiencing a classic Kirby game. For me, this uncertainty was best represented by the boss fights, arguably one of the franchise's greatest strengths. Many other 2D platformers tend to neglect their main battles, often reducing them to little more than obligatory encounters, despite the fact that I was fairly confident that the developers understood how to craft equally outstanding fights in 3D, especially given Blowout Blast had already laid a promising seed. I couldn't be certain that Kirby's transition into 3D would fully live up to the expectations. Unfortunately, my concerns proved unfounded. Not only do the bosses stay true to the series' legacy, but in some cases they even surpass the limitations of 2D. At the same time, while none of the bosses are disappointing, some feel like they're holding back their full potential. This is especially evident in how most post-game variations improve so drastically on their originals, making you wonder just how much more could be possible in the future. So why bring up all these formalities when Forgotten Land DDD, a relatively new addition to the series, so effortlessly claims second place? Because each DDD battle in this game follows the exact pattern I just described. Initially they feel somewhat underwhelming, leaving me concerned about what's to come, but as the fights progress, they reveal glimpses of a distinct creative vision, one that ultimately materializes into something spectacular. It's a perfect example of how, no matter how old or established the character may be, there's always room for improvement. The setup alone builds plenty of anticipation. Being thrown into the Forgotten Land with no explanation of who or what is responsible for the chaos sparks curiosity and keeps players wondering what might have happened. As the game progresses, we see familiar faces like classic enemies, Head Goomba, and even Meta Knight transported to the strange world. Yet one major figure remains conspicuously absent. That mystery is resolved at the end of the fourth world when DDD is revealed as the apparent ruler of the Beast Pack, with With a ferocious new look, he leads the enemy forces in their mission to capture Alphalin. The first battle against Dedede is initially quite trivial. Many of his moves originate from Blowout Blast, and his trump card, wielding one of the arena's pillars as a weapon, is an interesting idea, though not exactly groundbreaking. In fact, it feels rather underwhelming, especially for players who have already faced Meta Knight by this point. His fight, arguably one of the best Meta Knight duels in the entire series, set an incredibly high bar. By comparison, Dedede's first battle feels like a missed opportunity. In hindsight, the first confrontation was merely an appetizer. There had to be more. The return of a slightly altered masked Dedede, now wielding dual hammers and backed by an already iconic soundtrack, quickly made up for my original lukewarm impression. But any longtime fan knows that when a boss health bar starts draining too quickly, something bigger is about to unfold. That's when Forgotten Land Dedede broke free from established shackles. Watching him drop to all fours, moving with raw animalistic ferocity and unleashing a barrage of unpredictable new attacks, made for an unforgettable moment. His mannerisms alone seamlessly align with the Beast Pack, proving that even a well-established rival can evolve without drastic reinventions. This is the real Dedede fight of the Forgotten Land, and it's what makes the encounter so special. Something I have only mentioned in Star Allies case is post-game content and its harder boss variations. The reason is simple: these versions typically reinforce the original fights rather than redefining it. Faster attacks and minor tweaks add challenge but rarely alter the core experience. Forgotten Land, however, breaks that mold. Some bosses change so dramatically in the post-game that they feel like entirely new encounters, showcasing the expanded possibilities of a 3D space. The more a boss evolves beyond its original form, the more worthwhile the post-game becomes. And this is exactly why this fight more than earns its second place ranking. And surprisingly enough, it's quite challenging. The sudden arena shifts, lava hazards and near constant dangerous surfaces are bound to catch many players off guard. As I've emphasized many times in my Forgotten Land boss ranking, this fight is just the beginning of a bright future full of interesting 3D boss possibilities. If you have watched my Superstar Ultra boss ranking, this placement shouldn't come as a surprise, given my strong appreciation for a proper rival battle between the two key figures of the franchise. Today, Masked Dedede is used so frequently, it's hard to believe that he wasn't a part of the series from the very beginning, a testament to how much of an impact this battle left on players for all the right reasons. As part of the remake, Revenge of the King is one of the several new modes added to Superstar Ultra, essentially combining Revenge of the Meta Knight and Spring Breeze into the ultimate Dedede-focused experience. Unlike Meta Knight's campaign, however, there's no time limit, just a noticeable spike in difficulty, closely resembling the hard mode from the original Dreamland. In fact, if Spring Breeze can be seen as a rough remake of Dreamland, the same easily applies to Revenge of the King. It expands each area with additional level sections, reintroduces enemies previously only seen in Dreamland's hard mode, and finally brings back Karbula, who was missing from Spring Breeze. All of this is crucial in building up what's to come. A memorable battle benefits greatly from proper build-up. Just as Revenge of the Meta Knight used crew banter to give insight into their thoughts, Revenge of the King does the same with Dedede and Bandana D. This time Castle Dedede isn't just a simple boss room but a fully realized level. Even the title screen makes it clear that Dedede means business with no goofy gimmicks. After a suitable challenging journey, the moment to step into the ring has arrived, but this time there's no applause. All that waits is a lone hammer offered to even the odds and set the stage for the most iconic Dedede battle in the franchise. You might think that a roaring crowd would make the moment feel grander, but the attendant effect, a personal one-on-one showdown between old rivals, is captured even better in this quiet setting. Dedede offering Kirby an equal weapon might just be a gameplay mechanic, but it adds to the tension, making the build-up even more thrilling, much like Meta Knight's duel on the sinking halberd. However, the atmosphere and staging can only take you so far if the battle itself isn't worth getting excited about. At the end of the day, solid boss design is the most crucial element, and considering how often this fight is reused in modern titles, it's safe to say it gets things right. While Masked Dedede's moveset shares some similarities with his regular counterpart, nearly every attack is either significantly enhanced or completely reworked. His new jet hammer being a prime example. The projectiles and high speed swings force you to take to the air, but the electric cage surrounding the arena severely limits your movement. Flying over every obstacle is no longer an option, adding an extra layer of timing when gliding. Incorporating Kirby's floating ability into the gameplay, rather than just using it to correct jumps, is something I want to see more. This fight does it perfectly, forcing you to navigate the limited airspace while dealing with Dedede's massive presence, making the battle appropriately challenging despite handing you one of the strongest abilities.